August 30th, 2025, Marina Crane from Sutina. So I'm just responding to like a comment that was made on my YouTube, and I want to clarify these things because we live in a time where there's a lot of opportunists, a lot of people who do social media, and they get involved with politics or their values and beliefs, and they struggle. I just try to stick with one topic. I I I try not to deal with other issues because it's just sort of a cyclical thing. You get caught up in a web, and anyway, it leads you places. I um I did a video about my response to our chief, Roy Whitney, being arrested last a couple of weeks ago. And the comment was many of these crimes stem from deep generational trauma born of colonialism, which severed so many people from traditional indigenous role models, mentors who once fostered strength, balance, and healthy values. Without that guidance, many have lost their way, having the path to healing and long arduous for you and your community. So, um, as an elder, when I talk to people about trafficking or just about lateral violence or um, restorative and transformative justice, I say I don't talk about a week or a year. I talk in decades, and I'm talking from my own experience with lateral violence and the injustice that I had lived through. I haven't really like thought about things. I just sort of just managed to navigate my own life, and like, for example, uh, Phil Fontaine, leader in Canada, had scrupulously, and I might use the word in English in an inappropriate way, and he maybe have been meticulous about this with him and his colleagues, non-Indigenous colleagues, just like when they had class action lawsuits, they just said, okay, 10,000. We give out 10,000. Indian residential school, 10,000. And for each additional year, 1,000. Uh, day homes again, or like foster homes, 10,000. Every lawsuit, class action lawsuit that has been fought for Indigenous children, it's just a typical, this is it. No argument for more money, even though some of the crimes that were committed against these children were horrific. It's just like, hello. And the response is like the Canadian government just, a blanket here's the money. I mean, because it's just like the blanket and there's truth and reconciliation. For me personally, as an Indigenous person, I find even within my own culture, we'll say different tribes, there are a lot of opportunists who get paid money to go in social media and talk about politics or whatever. And that's okay, because 50 years ago in the 70s, there was nothing much about social media, Indigenous social media. We had a newspaper in Edmonton, and we had some video, and that was it. Not too many things about Indigenous communities or what was happening was ever posted. Now, today, like a couple of years ago, I was talking to some youth and I said, what do you want to accomplish in life? What's your educational goals? And pardon my asthma here. They said they wanted to be social media influencers. Like the whole point of being on a computer, having your TV, having your phone at hand. I mean, the reality is like AI and just the whole notion of what is spiritual, what is going to be Chris, what is creation type of thing. Because my growing up, it was animism. I think they call it when you just you believe in spirit. Because we had no TV or radio, and I grew up in that age where there was no social assistance either. And so when my father lost his dad, his aunties and uncles took care of him without cost because there was no social assistance, nothing. The government would just basically take kids, put them in residential schools, or sell them, like we're livestock. And fortunately, my father wasn't sold, but he did serve in residential school, and it was traumatic for him. And at age 14, the war broke out, and he joined the military when he was 18. And then after the war ended, when he was 18 years old, uh, he he still enlisted with the Patricia Light Infantry in Calgary. For me as a child, I didn't understand the how elite that section of the army is. I'm just saying there are some things that happen in our communities where we erase a person's life by somebody creating a story better than, say, my father. And I've had to fight that my whole life. I said, no, if people were in World War II, their children would be 75, 73, like in their 70s. Some people claiming to be veterans and their children are only like in their 50s and 60s. I don't think so. Like I said, my father was 14 when the war broke out. And when the war ended, he was 18. Okay, but the reality of what I'm trying to say is that um, for me as an Indigenous person navigating social media and and having talked with people who do use social media, I just find it's very interesting how people get contracts here and there from different companies within the city of Calgary or just within the nation itself, and people are hungry to learn and try and understand what it is to live in First Nations, Inuit, or Métis communities. I've lived a life where I've met so many Inuit, Métis, and Indigenous people, um, that it's such a small community that somehow you meet somebody who knew you or has met someone you've known like when you were 18 or 20. So a lot of times when people pretend to be something they're not, people like me will step in and say, who's your relative? Who do you know? And then that's when they get offended. But again, I'm digressing about social media and the hunger that people have to try and investigate what it is to be Indigenous or what does it take to be a good ally. Now, a lot of times I think a lot of Indigenous people on social media exploit good intentioned non-Indigenous people. And that's okay, but the reality of it is like there are so many people out there, for example, who during the treaty conference from 1 to 11, a lady that I knew when I was like in my, 19, she's 2 years older than me. Her whole life, she's like, she just loves paperwork. She just loves all this treaty stuff. Her whole life. She's 75 now. And, the reality of it is like, sometimes people in social media praise a group of people as if they're the experts in treaty relations, and they neglect that there are so many other Indigenous people who are knowledge keepers. Um, I mean, it goes to say, like, when I talk to some people, they say, I didn't know who you were. Or like they start talking to me and they start realizing who they're talking to. And that's okay. I mean, I'm not, like I said, I don't subscribe to Patreon or anything like that to get any attention from like anything that I put out there. I'm just a novice in podcasting and YouTubing. I've been blogging for like 20 years, and the majority of times it's just been consistent. I've been trying to be consistent in warning people about trauma and warning people the reasoning to advocate and use your voice and have courage to bear witness to the injustice that you witness. A lot of times these elders older than myself, my mother, my grandmother's age, who saw horrific things in these schools and have never bore witness to the injustice. And that legacy carries on within the community. Like we just the comment again here is like your voice is speaking about healing, restorative justice, and the power of community to profound is profoundly important. When communities unite around a shared goal of rehabilitation for both those harmed and those who have caused the harm, true healing becomes possible. Drawing upon Indigenous ways of knowing offers a vital guide for navigating those painful realities. It is not an easy journey, but one worthy of every effort, for healing can only flourish in safe and nourishing environment. And that's been consistently my um, voice for the past 20 years. Understanding those things of what it means to be in a safe and nurturing environment. And this past month, it's been quite triggering for my community because our chief was arrested in two historical charges of young men in their 30s who he sexually assaulted. And they're in their 60s now. And then as it bubbles and percolates to the top and how it triggers so many people in my community, I wasn't prepared for it. Like I just it's heartbreaking. It really is because people start talking and there's no safe, like they don't realize when they're talking it's not a safe place. I used to talk for decades about being sexually assaulted, thinking my words were going to be transmitted by smoke signal to my perpetrator so my perpetrators would know they hurt me. That's an illusion or a delusion. When you're talking about stuff that happened to you and you're trying to find an ally to listen, you're trying to find someone who's going to uh, have us, not going to spread the gossip or rumor mongering or get the juice, like the nitty gritty of like salaciousness. I, you, it's like a soap opera. That's not healthy at all. So when people talk to me about Chief Roy Whitney, I say, no comment. If you want to know the juicy, skinny on the salacious part of it, go to the preliminary hearing. Go when he's being presented in court. Anything else that you try to do is just not beneficial to community. So why I'm doing this podcast is because it's just the things that I've been hearing that is just so heartbreaking. And one of my community members says, yeah, I was talking with your cousin, and he mentioned that he witnessed someone sexually assaulting his brother. And I've had other stories, where I've talked and confronted young men who've disclosed they've been sexually assaulted. And these men are now in their 50s, and I say to them, you're still here. You still have there's nothing stopping you from reporting them. But because it just percolated from the bottom to our main chief, so many people are triggered, and rightfully so. Rightfully so. We, as women, we tend to be salacious in our own trauma. Oh, I this happened to me, that happened to me, and it's like I'm most of the time it's like for attention, forgetting that there are boys and young men that are victims. And that's what I said. It's heartbreaking. It truly is. I know as a child, I didn't bear witness, but I did suspect things were happening to my brothers. But I was a child. I couldn't help them. And maybe in some ways, the way I was raised as a traditional Dakota person, the oldest, who had to mother, my siblings, that I felt um, that I let them down. Now, understanding the psychology of disclosure and just the whole storytelling or narrative of a child who's telling their story, and how you have to be trained to navigate whether or not they're telling the truth or if they're doing it for attention. And that's the danger in all of this. Sometimes, like with my late niece, she wasn't believed. And you have to have patience that someday these children will grow up, find the courage, and go to the police. I admire the young men who have done this. I know there's a lot more out there. That's what's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking knowing that because of the response that I'm hearing from my community. People lashing out at other people, threatening them with their lives because they're upset. The rumor mongering and just the salaciousness. I'm just like, I just can't believe it. And yet at the same time, as all this is going on, people are living their lives, and there's reports of other people who've been charged with sexual assault. There are reports of high risk behavior, people not wanting to live in this world. So the ugliness of violence and repercussions of what people do to children, and that those children have a hard time walking in this life and want to leave. I work as a knowledge keeper for a coalition of youth workers in the city of Calgary, and we have discussions about children who talk about wanting to leave this earth. Imagine children, and it's heartbreaking, and yet sometimes I just wonder, as a woman, what can we do to support each other? I know it's one thing for me to do a podcast. So, and she said, this lady who made a comment, she says, you mentioned choosing not to get involved yourself with the charges against your chief. Yet, as an elder, with your depth of knowledge and experience, your perspective carries great weight and can help light a way for others in your community. You are exactly right when you say, when we heal, we evolve. So, um, like I said, I don't talk in terms of yesterday or last year. I talk in terms of decades. And for me, when I was a child and we had no TV, or we had radio, but we had no TV, and for a while we had no electricity, and again, no social services. I lived off the land, ate rabbit. I remember at 5 years old going down the snare line, eating from the land, and then being bused into the city of Calgary for the schools. I think I've lived a really unique life with a lot of opportunities that most Indigenous people don't have or haven't had. But at the same time, too, I've also lived in a country that, even though I'm protected within my community because I live right by a city, bust in and out to a city school every day. Like, if you close your eyes and you listen to my voice, you wouldn't think that I was Indigenous. I, but because of colonialism, and again, because um, the government wasn't making things easier for my parents. They were both survivors of residential school, and they worked hard. My parents worked hard their entire lives. No social assistance with my parents. I mean, not until I think the 70s. Yeah, and it was really difficult when people came in and tried to, put my brothers and sisters in foster care. My mother, when my father and her separated for a year, she put us into residential school. And that was in Manitoba because my mother was originally from Manitoba, even though we live in Alberta. Out of all my siblings, I'm the only one who was born in Manitoba. And again, because of my age and being older, I'm the only one I think that spoke Sioux fluently until I was 5. Um, Even though I lived in Sutina and I was bussed into the city I went to school at a day school when I was 5 years old here in Sutina, and we'd walk to school for 2 years. It was like a mile away we'd walk, and some of the other children rode horseback. I don't think people understand the nature of horseback, like, you know, some people think, "Oh, that's like a, Wild West thing," but no, it I love horseback. I love, riding on a horse full gallop and, just the nature of being around a horse. Um, but then we got bussed into the city, and the class action lawsuit was for Indian residential school, first 10,000. Forget how long ago that was, maybe 20 years ago. And then day school program came out, so I was eligible for that because I went to school in my community before I was bussed in. I got bussed in when I was grade 2, so I had 2 years in day school, and I had 2 years in residential school. Now, the residential school I went to, I didn't get educated in that school. It's a historical site called Portage la Prairie. Now, it so happens the irony of it is that my grandmother, Daisy Dewan Crane Crowchild, went to that residential school too. And I remember her and my grandfather, David Crowchild, came to visit me and my brother and sister there. I can't even imagine the the things she went through in that place, or my mother in Elkhorn, Manitoba, or my father in Edmonton, the residential school there. I just can't comprehend that because I have been around non-Indigenous people my entire life when I get educated. That's what it was in Portage. We all lived in the residence, but we were bussed into Portage la Prairie's public school system. Did that for 2 years. I was in junior high and I was one of the youngest attendees. And they only made exception for me and my sister to attend because of the legacy that my grandmother attended there. And because my grandparents were politically active and so was my parents and my family, I was treated like a princess. I had one of the administrators, a notorious person who, like, later on when I had a lawyer, I found out that, like, how destructive he was. And I thought, well, why was I spared being uh, uh, SA'd by him? It's because I remember he says, you should be ashamed of yourself and who your family is. And I thought, who's my family? Like, what is he talking about? Like, I was like 16, 17 years old. No comprehension of the political connections or the trouble he could get into if I started crying, bloody murder. So, like, and I'm being invited to talk in Portage on October 8th and 9th, on trafficking. Unknown caller. Sorry, I should have set. I should have put my phone on silent. Anyway, um, class action lawsuits. So that's two. residential school and day school. And then came day home, where you're not in your parents' home, but you're billeted out someplace while you're going to school. Now, I didn't know this. Like when my parents went to South America, I stayed with teacher and her my like a teacher, grade 5 teacher and his wife in Edmonton. And I almost died. I had to go to the Indian hospital there. And then at 10 years old when my parents went to India, I stayed with a group of teachers, women, female teachers in Edmonton. Again, I'm not like I wasn't in school. I should have been in school, but they kept me like a day home, to, homeschooling. And then I ran away from my home when I was 17. I was 17. I was turning 18 in January. And then at 19 I stayed with my aunt and uncle for 2 years. Now even that too was horrendous. Um, like I said, because of colonialism, like my father didn't experience that. When his aunts and uncles took care of him, there was no money exchange. There was no social assistance. But for me, my aunt took advantage. I didn't even know she was collecting money for me. I was babysitting for her for nothing. So these claims, I have to document, as well as like I went to high school I was in a home in Calgary as well, and with a non-Indigenous couple, and just the being targeted by the husband. So things like that, that's part of the class action lawsuit. That's what day home. Now on top of that too, there's also Indian hospital claim. And because I was 9 years old and I was in Edmonton and I almost died, I had stayed in an Indian hospital, I think, for 3 or 4 months. And the tragedy of all that is like being so young, I did not understand. I was in isolation by myself for 90 days or so. The only people that came into my room were doctors or nurses. I had no reading material, no TV, nothing. I think that's why today I enjoy being alone, but I think there's a lot of psychological stuff that I managed to maneuver throughout my life without realizing that, the Canadian government did this to me. Systemic racism did this to me. I didn't ask for it, nor did I understand the genocide of it. So, um, and that's why I'm talking about historical things when I talk about decades, and even the understanding of restorative justice. We have so many Indigenous people in the prison system. And again, the government has created this. It's not our fault, but it's our responsibility to understand like what does this mean? So that's why I try and do these podcasts. And I talk about my life and the injustice that I saw and how I maneuvered in terms of my mental health. What is it that I had to do to remain healthy, mentally healthy, and physically look after myself? I try and tell people I've never had a partner. I had to look after myself by myself, living in the States, had no help. I people say, "Oh, well, you're resilient." I don't like the word resilient because, when you're struggling to pay your bills, where's resiliency? Is it a bank called resiliency? No, it isn't. It's just being alone and struggling and hoping, just hoping. And I think in some senses, when I talk to young people about hope and about self-compassion, is to maybe have the ability to self-reflect and even coping and understanding. It's not a easy thing, especially when so many people are just busy just trying to make a living, not even understanding what grooming or human trafficking is. And I think a lot of people don't realize that human trafficking isn't just sexual. It has to do with a person's livelihood. When they're working and, the powers that be, their bosses, are threatening them that if they don't comply, they'll lose their jobs. That's human trafficking too. Grooming, like, like you're being groomed for a job. If leadership understood grooming and how they were grooming their children, would they have catered to their children's every whim, paying for their education out of nation money? Would they have done that? That's part of grooming too. And a lot of times when, I talk about Nathan Chasing Horse and the grooming my community did with his followers, because it was grooming, like anything they needed or wanted, they got paid for. Their rent, cost of living, travel, on top of all that too, if, the beck and call of leadership. As long as they protected his followers, if the leadership wanted him to come in for ceremony, he'd drop everything and come. People paying money every month. His contact here would send money orders to him to pay for him, help him live his life. There's 16 terabytes of information that is going to be displayed in Nevada, Las Vegas, Nevada, on January 16th, 2026. I tried to say there's more to just the trafficking, the sexual assault, the child porn, and the grooming. There's tax evasion, money laundering, and money laundering, racketeering. Yeah, and I say to people, understand this. In every indigenous community, they have terabytes of information, like records of who gave him what and how much. Like he bought a ranch in I think New Mexico. You know, getting cars, and it's amazing the amount of money he was able to recruit with people. When I talk about Sutina, I'm just talking about my community. I'm not talking about the other indigenous communities in the United States or in Canada that fell victim to Nathan Chasing Horse, like people in my community. And I think a lot of times people tend to look the other way because it's not happening in our community because we don't believe in trafficking. Because again, their stereotype of trafficking has to do with prostitution. Oh, did he traffic all of those girls? Like, excuse me. Use a little common sense here, people. It just amazes me that as much as we think we're educated, or as much as we think we're there to support others, we're basically taking baby steps. And with Chief Roy Whitney being arrested, and just the anger that especially men have in my community, and it's not going to be over. It isn't. And I try to tell people, uh, my brother paid the price of negotiating with Nathan Chasing Horse for my niece. My, when people want to throw my brother's name in front of me, I say he paid his price. He served his time. He knows what he did. I said, do you know my niece is dead now? As a family, I said, we know we live in this community, and the politics, even for me to go to chief and council to argue that my brother's children stay in Sutina. And I couldn't do that for my niece because she wasn't a Sutina Nation member. The things that I just couldn't do for her that I tried to do. So I tried to educate people on child psychology, the naivete I had about child welfare. I have an acquaintance that we do talks, and she's a retired social worker who worked on Sutina, and just the things that she's had to live through and experience, and the whole nature of social assistance, like the child welfare system. Um, Sometimes I just think that, like, instead of working to help, they're a hindrance. They're a hindrance. And I'm a strong believer in restorative justice and transformative justice, only because I've lived long enough to experience it within my own life to know and say that it is possible. It is possible to heal. It is possible to understand how justice is served, and to have faith in humanity, to have faith in the people you grew up with, that they're going to make the right decisions for you and for their families. Sometimes when I hear the maliciousness or the anger, I just can't comprehend how leadership can live in a structure like that, and knowing that they face it every day. So for me, trying to talk about restorative and transformative justice, and to let people know these things just don't happen in a year. Some take 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. In my case, 50 years. I lived long enough to see all this transformation. And and I think in a way, I just hope people have the courage, young people have the courage to be patient, have faith that just they'll have the ability to have bear witness of the injustice that they had inflicted on them, that they will see some retribution, that they can walk with their head held high. It's I don't know. Um, in my life, when I've worked with teenage girls, and documenting like their struggle just to stay alive, and knowing that anything would trigger them, and we had to watch them 24/7. And I hear stories of a relative who ended her life, and yet the family was there 24/7 watching her. Stories within my community. Now, as non-Indigenous people, you live in a city, an urban area where you don't even know your neighbors. You don't hear these stories. You don't attend funerals of people that you've grown up with. You've lost connection with community, and it's not like that's just the way society is set up. And I know from a non-Indigenous point of view, or people who look within the community, they think, "Oh, I want to belong to that community." And it's not easy. You hold that space for people, and they take advantage, especially in social media, podcasts, anything where somebody's going to make a dollar just to tell their story. Yet for me, I try to be consistent in the sense that what I'm talking about has already happened, or what I talk about has to do with the fact that people are trying their best. They are trying their best to just do the best they can for their families and their grandchildren. And the fact that systemic racism is so real out there that people would rather gravitate to some narrative where people don't have that foundation. It's just like all of a sudden you're Indigenous, you've got a status card, yet you've never lived in an Indigenous, Métis, or Inuit community. You lived in an urban setting your whole life, and then you get paid for it. I mean, it's harsh words that I'm saying, but there's also people who've actually lived in Inuit, Indigenous, and Métis communities who really, do their narrative. They really know how to create create the drama or the storytelling. So I hope in some ways like that what I do and how I say my podcast uh, does have some significant um, like some moments of like clarity or moments of like I understand you, Marina, type of moments. I hope they do. I I don't know how much more I can do to educate people about the nature of healing. I've like growing up in the way I grew up as a child and then having to navigate through the white world in psychology at the same time to understanding that I'm living in my childhood community, understanding too the significance of spirituality. You know, a lot of times people want to gravitate to that and exploit that. And it's not up to me to say don't exploit it because, creators probably guided them in some path. Like I'm a firm believer that we bump into people for a reason. There's a lesson that we have to learn. And as hard as the lesson is, we have to have patience with ourselves to understand it and to embrace it. And then at the same time to release it. So I just have um I don't know what the time is because I can't see it. I should have again, I apologize because I don't have my glasses. I okay, so I do have some time. I'm trying to make this an hour. So I'll go into my own uh, decades of restorative and transformative justice, just in terms of sexual assault. I was never trafficked in the sense of prostitution. As much as people want to put me in that little square box or the little circle, I'm sorry, but you know, when that happens, I just say I'm sorry. Like it sort of reflects on them too, what they perceive as being indigenous, because they want to put you in that, and they want to stereotype you in. When I trigger them and they come around and they're so profoundly happy that I'm talking openly, yet it gets a little overwhelming because I have to protect myself from people who really want to be healed. And you know, I try to guide people in the right direction to, get help or source it out for them or help them source it out. So we'll start off, like I said, I went through there's 4 classic action lawsuits that I'm involved in, and all these things happened to me before I was even 18 years old. And so throughout the decades with different groups of organizations throughout Canada, fighting on behalf of survivors of these events that the government created. In all of that, here I am. I saw family violence, but my mother really protected us more so than I think. For me, I can say that I only because I know how horrific some relatives or people I've grown up with had it in their own homes. And even non-Indigenous people too, because I mean, I looked after high suicide teenage girls who were non-Indigenous. So, um, I was, I've always been this way. I always say, we're as children in Dakota culture, we're born holy, and so we throughout our lives we try to maintain this status quo. And if you can imagine being the center of a circle and always trying to find balance so that you're in that center is like a learning. You have to understand how to maneuver and understand these gifts Creator has given us so that we find ourselves in our center. So when I ran away, well, again, I was in Manitoba from 15 to 16, came home 17, went to high school, didn't like it, ran away to Vancouver, was in Vancouver, I think, for about 6 months, came home, was sexually assaulted at 19, and by two serial rapists who had who had apparently been doing this probably a lot longer than the past, like until like the past 5 years of my being a teenager, because it was documented that over 12 women had disclosed to the RCMP uh, that I was like the 12th victim or 13th victim, and I was the youngest, and that all of these women refused to support me in court. And knowing about trafficking and grooming, and understanding just the violence the violence perpetrators will inflict, especially if you're a woman whose husband beats the bejesus out of you. It's the same mentality of the predator trying to silence the victim. And so understand, like, the 12 women who disclosed this had happened to them had to have had children or had been working for the nation, and maybe in some way they just felt like if they disclosed, they would lose their jobs. Like, for example, when the Fifth Estate came into Sutina, they questioned a lot of people, and a lot of people didn't want to be interviewed. And again, that's part of trafficking, because if you say something, you could lose your job. So that's why I say, like, the two men who disclosed they were sexually assaulted by the chief took a lot of courage, a lot of courage. Now, I try to say historically, 50 years ago, when I was sexually assaulted, the law stated that I would have had to disclose to someone. Now, imagine that as a woman, and I go to court. Say if I did disclose within the year, I'd have to go to court with that witness sitting with me or being there in the courtroom with me as a woman. They're not looking at me as a individual who has individual power with my own narrative. I'd have to have somebody with me as a female. Now 30 now go 20 more years in the future. 30 years ago, when I went to court, nothing was published until after the perpetrator had been sentenced. And then again, people in the community, oh, it doesn't happen here in Sutina. We live in Never Never Land, in the land of the Peter Pan and Captain Hook, Disney. These things don't happen to us here. And so, like, again, silencing my narrative. They'd rather have me talk about fairy tales and the unicorns and witches and warlocks than the actual reality of the fact that, hey, there were women who, a or like decades before me, who refused to even, you know, bear witness. They didn't have the capacity to give it a name. They didn't have the capacity to hold space, even though the RCMP and the legal system was there to provide that space. And if they had come to court with me, they would have bore witness to the injustice that was inflicted on them. But they chose not to. Now that's 30 years ago. Now today they published they published this record of what happened to these two young men. And they've called out to say, any other person who's been victim to Chief Roy Whitney, please come forward. And I try to express that this is transformative justice. There it's restorative justice is to bear witness to the injustice. So understand that even 30 years ago, when I went to court, bore witness in trial, faced my perpetrator, and said to my perpetrator, what you did to me hurt me. What you did to me hurt me. Like, that's not gossip, that's not creating a narrative. This was the actual fact that even though you couldn't see the physical scars or anything, I'm admitting to people in the courtroom, this is what happened to me. So just that whole process of being there and having people support you is 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 so empowering. It's so transformative. People say what I do and how I say things. I didn't know this 30 years ago. When people said, "Oh, well, Marina, you can help victims." Didn't know. So when things like this, when these things were happening, and even though I had the experience of working with high-risk teenage girls, it was different when it came to my family. And that's why, even I'm not understanding child welfare, all these things in the past 30 years or 20 years, I've had to learn. I've had to deconstruct things and reconstruct them and just basically hope that I would find invisible helping hands to educate me. And I'm grateful that I have. I'm grateful that I have. And even throughout the past 50 years, some of like the two serial rapists, the one died at 28, the other fellow is still alive. Um, but their wives too. One of them is dead, and the other one is alive. And the one who's deceased, uh, we I was friends with her. My cousin and I, we were friends with her, and then we were also associated with a lifelong friend of mine too that I was friends with for 30 years. So when I say the narrative takes place over decades, a lot of things that I didn't know that were happening in my community all fit together as a puzzle as I went to court and I was talking with friends, and they all pasted things together of how they saw me when I was 19. And so, I confronted the one woman who's alive, and I said, "I don't want to leave this world with regrets." I said, "I just wanted to let you know I may have been playing unconscious in that car, lying still in the cold with blood all over my face, but I heard you come to the window, and look in and say, 'Look at what they did to that poor girl.'" Then I heard them go into the house, and the next thing I know, I hear them screaming, getting into their car, and taking off. It wasn't until 20 years ago, after he was sentenced and found guilty, that my friend of 30 years said to me, "Was that you?" And I said, "Yeah." She says, "That morning, Marina, they dropped her off at my place." She said, "That morning when they went up into that house to confront him for what he did to you, he took a baseball bat to the both of them. Because I heard them screaming while I was laying in a pool of blood, frozen pool of blood." And I thought, they're not gonna help me because they were scared. Like, I can't even comprehend, and probably this is triggering for a lot of women who have, had husbands who, have beaten them, who live in family violence, and, if I trigger you, I'm sorry, because sometimes I just it just doesn't click for me because for me, I'm putting the puzzle together to let people know, and especially when I'm talking about restorative justice and transformative justice, and how people who do things to other people, victimize people, how the community takes care so that people, realize and don't reoffend. And so when I had talked to the lady and I said, I don't want to have any regrets. And she says, I said, that morning, I said, because it's a mutual friend, I said, she told me what happened. Like after like she had said, "Oh, I was going to go to court and testify against you that my sister found you in bed with her husband." and she took steel-toed boots and kicked you in the head. And after I disclosed to her that the story was false and that she'd created this narrative for the past 30 years, understand this, didn't know all this narrative about me was going on within my community. Okay, so again, because I did not press charges when I was 19, I waited I waited until I was in my 30s, like heading into my 40s before I even charged the guy. And because of that, so many people within the community believed the narratives of, the women who were scared to even be around me. Like the other sister, we were my cousin and I were bar hopping, and when I say bar hopping, I mean we'd go into a bar, and back then you go into a bar, men's section, and then you walk out women's section. So we weren't sitting in the pubs or the taverns. We'd walk in, look around. If we didn't see anybody, we'd come out to the women's section. So we'd bar hop downtown, and we went into one bar, and the lady says, "Let's get out of here." And I thought, what does she mean? So I thought, okay, she's scared, something's happening. So my cousin and I went out, followed her. She ran across the street. We ran after her. She stood there, and her husband that she'd been separated with caught up with us, grabbed her, and started beating her up. He had steel-toed boots on, and my cousin and I were screaming for help. And men came to pull him off of her, and the ambulance came and police came, and she was in the hospital for 2 weeks. Now, understand this, when the morning that I was assaulted, when they took off, screaming and left me in the pool of blood in the car, um, they dropped her off at my friend's place. At that time, she wasn't my friend. Understand this. This is historical. Uh, my friend said she took care of her for 2 weeks. He had beaten her up so bad with the baseball bat. That's why I'm saying, if it triggers you as women who've been battered by your husbands, and you're afraid to call the police to put them in jail for family violence, or if your children have been threatened, either, you know, having the husband put a gun to your head playing Russian roulette because he's drunk and you're afraid of them. Like, I've heard horrific stories. My friend had a horrific relationship with her very violent husband. Understand this too, this violence, women don't talk about. And because of that, a lot of these men have been voted into leadership, chief and council. So how safe is it for women to create space, especially if you're working, and your private life becomes public, and then you're threatened to lose your job if you say anything, or even if you question leadership on grooming or trafficking. So these things, within small communities, do exist within my community, and um, I think it's important because people get so angry. I mean, I've been hearing stories of young men who had meetings and people calling them and threatening them with their lives. I hear, I don't, like, I just try not to get involved, but I think this whole issue with the chief being arrested, also another sexual assault on one of our leadership, has is going to be charged, and then just people dying. It's really made our community in a state of crisis. And so I do my podcast, and I talk about transformative and restorative justice. When when I had documented what Nathan Chasinghorse was doing, and the Fifth Estate came to question me, some of the leadership and people were afraid to talk. Again, trafficking. Like, if you talk, you'll lose your position, or you won't have any position of power. And for me, it gave me credibility within my community. So the lady whose husband was a serial rapist, who's still alive. I mean, her husband died, I think, when he was 28. When she when she saw me after the show aired on the CBC Canada, as soon as she walked into the room, she looked at me and then she walked away. In the community, whether or not you see it, um, makes people accountable. I don't have to say anything to anybody now. Like, that's why I believe in transformative justice. How community takes care of perpetrators, um, how we try to take care of people who've been victimized. I see it, and I hope people. I do these podcasts hoping people in my community see the beauty that we live in. It takes patience. It takes patience and understanding that the prayers of our parents and the prayers of our grandparents are powerful. They had the ability to educate us. They had the ability to nurture us and to be strong in our identity as indigenous people. This isn't just something that, like they say, historical. This is something that we, as the legacy of all those thousands of children who never made it from those Indian residential schools, those thousands of children. But the first 100 years of colonization, over 1 million, 5 generations of children were murdered in North America. So, as Indigenous people, we do have that in us. We have that legacy in us to support and educate our relatives on the gifts that were blessed to us by Creator, our grandfathers and our grandmothers. This is why I do my podcast. This is why I try to educate people on restorative justice and transformative justice. The government and Canada might not understand it, and non Indigenous people might want to target us. But I try to get people to understand it does mean something. It does mean something to be Indigenous. So, with that, I close my podcast for today. It's just been a really overwhelming month for my community. And for those who are grieving, I just wish there was some comfort, that there's some grace that can help you. Somebody said grief is like a rock. You put it in your pocket. It never goes away, but it gets lighter. So I hope that whatever I say and try to do and educate people, that it does make a difference, and that we do embrace each other's qualities, because we are all gifted. Creator has blessed us with these things. So thank you very much.